It is unknown at this time the low level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that might actually destroy life, because plant life all depends, as you know, Secretary, plant life all depends on CO2. And when we kill it, then we're done too.
Why do you think 195 countries in the world, their prime ministers, their presidents?
Because they're grifting like you are, sir.
That's a pretty shocking statement, that you believe that all the scientists in the world are grifters, honestly.
Not all scientists agree with you, Mr. Secretary.
98% of all the scientists in the world.
Science isn't about agreement. It's not about consensus. You know that. So while you're here today, will you commit and will you pledge to oppose any effort to bail out the auto industry after you force it into bankruptcy again? Will you do that today, sir?
Congressman, I got started in politics when
I guess the answer is
the
no. I
Indiana
yield the
factory was at risk of being shut down because an elected official in my state tried to block the administration from saving Chrysler. I got involved and stood with the UAW to save those jobs, and I'll always be with auto jobs being preserved.
Look, I'm not from Maryland. I don't live around the Beltway here where everything's just fine. I live up in Pennsylvania where $1 billion or $1 million is a lot of money to hardworking people that get up in the dark at night and head out to work.
I did hear my colleague from Pennsylvania make some sort of disparaging remark about Maryland and about how he didn't live in Maryland, where apparently we don't understand the value of money. Well, the land where we actually are standing today used to be part of Maryland. It was ceded by Maryland to Congress for the purposes of creating the District of Columbia. And when our capital came under attack by violent insurrectionists and those who were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," and who were determined to overthrow the 2020 presidential election, there were hundreds of police officers who came from Maryland to join the Metropolitan Police Department and the Capitol officers in defense of the capital of the United States. So I take umbrage at any insinuation that the people of Maryland need to take a backseat to anybody in terms of the defense of the principles of this country. So I would thank Mr. Perry for a correction about that.
You can call any bill here anything you want to. You can call it the, kittens are beautiful and the sun's going to shine today. But here's what I know. In central Pennsylvania, where I live, the good citizens that I represent are paying $5, $6, $7 for a dozen eggs. They're paying $6, $7 for a pound of hamburger. They can't afford to drive to work, and they can't afford to pay their energy bills, and they're having a hard time paying their mortgage. That's inflation, sir.
Yes, the prices of housing are too high. The prices of groceries are too high. That's why the administration is working concretely to lower prices and why inflation is coming down now across the board. And so what do we get from the majority today? They want a reporting bill about the inflationary impact in executive orders. Nothing even about what Congress is doing and how Congress is behaving and contributing to inflation. They want to somehow add a technical reporting requirement for executive orders and think that that's accomplishing something. Well, the administration is lowering the cost of student debt despite the fact that they're doing everything they can to stop it. The administration is acting to lower housing prices across the country, and we have moved to lower prescription drug prices and health care across the country, and they've been fighting us every step along the way. And instead, they come back with this reporting bill, which will do nothing to help the fight against inflation.
This amendment requires for executive orders that are found to have an impact on the consumer price index, we got to have some measure, right? And most people recognize the consumer price index, which is a detailed description of that impact.
I'm afraid I remain unilluminated as to what that amendment will do. Apparently, the purpose is to require a more detailed or technical description of the projected impact when an assessment required by the bill finds that there will be some inflationary effect. Again, this sounds like it's simply adding more bureaucracy, more paperwork with no return on investment for the taxpayer dollars that it would obviously take to conduct such an analysis. I mean, here we've gone for more than 2 centuries with apparently no economist arguing that what we really need to stop inflation is more reporting in the process of issuance of executive orders by presidents of the United States. And suddenly, somebody had a great epiphany over there without even a legislative hearing that what was really needed was just for the President of the United States to append an inflationary statement to executive orders at the rate of $1 billion, perhaps to be amended to $1 million, or who knows, it's 50 million or 100 million. But it doesn't make any difference because there's no data behind any of it. Basically, they're scraping the bottom to try to figure out something to say about inflation because the administration is actually bringing inflation down. Now, we notice they don't talk about unemployment, which used to be their mantra, jobs, jobs, jobs. But when Joe Biden came back and created 12 million new jobs after the last administration destroyed millions of jobs with their lethal recklessness in the mismanagement of the coronavirus pandemic, and Joe Biden turned it around in this administration, they stopped talking about it. But they did notice that there was global inflation going on because of the disruption of the global supply chain and because of Vladimir Putin's filthy imperialist invasion of Ukraine, which some of their members actually are cheerleaders for. There was a real problem with inflation, and the administration has steadily been bringing it down, which is why it doesn't have quite the political salience it used to. But the world was waiting with bated breath to determine what would their actual plan be. And alas, their whole plan is a reporting requirement, nothing to do with Congress and Congress being able to do anything, but a reporting requirement for the president when he issues executive orders. I think the public is gravely disappointed by this complete collapse of any real commitment to the one issue they thought they had organized their conference around. I reserve.
Gentleman from Maryland, my friend from Maryland, talks about increased bureaucracy, the increased bureaucracy of informing the American people. My goodness, I've never heard that from my friends on the other side of the aisle, increased bureaucracy. I mean, all they do around here is infuse more government into our lives with every single thing they do. Talks about the medical situation and price fixing. He doesn't call it price fixing, but that's what it is. He's saying it's been unnecessary to do this. My goodness, my good friend from Maryland is a member of the legislature. You'd think he'd want to preserve the power of the legislature instead of handing it to the executive branch, which is what this place has done for years upon years. Now we have a chance, and my friend wants to hand yet more power to the executive branch instead of preserving the power of his branch that he serves in.
One can only regard with amazement the gentleman's insinuation that I want to hand power to the executive branch when we have been acting here in Congress to pass the Infrastructure Act, to pass the Inflation Reduction Act in the last Congress. All of the measures they opposed, we moved in order to make real economic progress in the country. Congress was doing that. They've got the big opportunity today to come forward with what their anti-inflation agenda is, and their whole anti-inflation agenda is we're going to beg the President of the United States to append some inflation numbers to an executive order, to a handful of executive orders over the course of the year. The gentleman also, I think, slipped in his opposition to our legislation, which reduces to $35 a month what diabetics have to pay for their insulin shots. He calls this price fixing. My friend from Pennsylvania is invited to contradict me if I misunderstood him. I think he was describing all of the lowering of prescription drug prices we've done. We're saving Americans across the country, millions of Americans, thousands of dollars in their Medicare prescription drug prices, and the gentleman just called that price fixing. I assume he's opposed to it. I'd be happy to yield if you want to correct me, but otherwise I'm going to go back with the conclusion that you're opposed to all of the lowering of prescription drug prices that the Congress actually engaged in the 117th Congress. And finally, the gentleman would like to somehow put in our court the burden of bureaucracy. Well, let's talk about the major bureaucracy that's being put in place in America today to violate the rights and the freedom of women to make their own medical decisions as they try to criminalize that. And most of them, I don't know exactly where the gentleman is, perhaps he can clarify it, most of them support a national ban on abortion, taking what was a constitutional right for more than a half century and turning it into a felony criminal offense or misdemeanor criminal offense. You want to talk about bureaucracy?
Time's expired.
You want to talk about a police state? That's on you. I yield back.
Thank you, Secretary. In an attempt to get to net zero by 2050, do you support the administration's goal of cutting U.S. emissions in half by 2030?
Yes, I do.
Secretary, in 1997, the Senate voted 95-0, including you and then Senator Biden, in favor of the Byrd-Hagel resolution, which resolved that the U.S. shouldn't cut emissions until China, Mexico, India, Brazil, South Korea, and other so-called developing nations cut emissions as well. Do you remember that?
I do very, very well because I was managing it on the floor of the Senate.
Since 97, have emissions from China, India, and Mexico all increased?
Yes, as they have from the United States.
And global emissions have continued to increase as well, right?
Yes.
Have any of those countries submitted a credible plan to get to net zero emissions by 2050?
Which countries?
Let's just go with China, India, or Mexico.
No.
It seems that, have you abandoned your position that those other nations would cut emissions before Americans would have to make choices between the groceries on their table and paying for these policies?
I think the reality is that the world changed in that period of time. Let me explain
okay,
to you.
So you voted that way, but
let me explain to you the vote, because I did manage this on the floor. And I know exactly what happened because I'm the one who said to our colleagues, I think everybody ought to vote for this. And the reason was that it fundamentally had the message that it's not fair. The one we were talking about earlier with the chairman, it's not fair for us to be reducing, and China, which was producing 3 times more emissions than us, and then producing goods that come into our country from that dirty power, and we have a problem. So we wanted to address that. But we knew not every aspect of that piece of legislation is what you all call, we all call, a message. It was a message vote. And the vote was clear. We wanted other people to join us in the effort to reduce emissions.
Okay, fair enough.
That hasn't happened sufficiently.
It hasn't happened sufficiently. Now, Secretary, in 2015 at the Paris Climate Conference, you said that if all industrial nations go to zero emissions, it wouldn't be enough. And then at the White House's Climate Day in January of 21, you said almost 90% of the planet's emissions come from outside the U.S. We could go to zero tomorrow, and the problem isn't solved. And in April 21, you told the Washington Post that even the U.S. and China going to zero emissions tomorrow won't solve the climate's problem. Then in April of 21, you said that global net zero is not enough and that CO2 must be removed from the atmosphere. How much is the correct amount of CO2?
Let me explain to you, if I can, so you understand exactly what I said. It's close, but it's not quite exactly what I was saying.
Can you just tell me what the correct amount is?
Let me tell you what I'm saying. I'm going to tell you what the correct. Here's how it works. Because we have put, I forget the exact number of tons, millions of tons of CO2 and other greenhouse gases are now in the atmosphere. They're there. And every day we're adding more. And so every day the heat is going up, and we have to figure out how we're going to, tame the monster here. The only way to do that is to reduce emissions on an ongoing basis to get control on the current level of emissions that we have created.
But what
actually suck?
Sir, with all due respect, you've been through this before. What is the correct amount? I don't want to spend a bunch of time about a history lesson about things that people don't care about.
What changes every day? I can't tell you exactly what
the correct amount changes.
Yes, it does.
So, Secretary, you probably know that for approximately 200 million years, what's the parts per million now? About 400, right? Can we agree on that?
It's over 400.
All right,
it's about
200 million years, 2,000 parts per million. Did Mother Nature get it wrong for 200 million years?
Here's the difference, Congressman. The difference is, yes, there were periods which all the scientists who deal with climate acknowledge that there have been moments on the planet, which is billions of years old, in which there were greater heat and there was greater.
Tell me the difference quickly. I've got a little.
The difference is human beings are creating this. That's the difference.
So human beings are about 300,000 years old, but during these periods of time where it was 2,000 parts per million, life existed. As a matter of fact, we're in one of the lowest
not
periods.
human beings walking around.
We're in one of the lowest periods of carbon in the atmosphere in not only recorded history, in the history of life existing on the planet.
Congressman, let me just say that I don't agree with what you're saying out there for any number of reasons. I don't have time to go into all of them now, but I'll just tell you point blank that the difference between the periods you're looking at in terms of heat, et cetera, and human input is night and day, number one. Number two, Why do you think 195 countries in the world, their prime ministers, their presidents?
Because they're grifting like you are, sir.
That's a pretty shocking statement, that you believe that all the scientists in the world are grifters, honestly.
Not all scientists agree with you, Mr. Secretary.
98% of all the scientists in the world.
Science isn't about agreement. It's not about consensus. You know that.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Sherfilis McCormick for 5 minutes.
Secretary, thank you for coming. Thanks for listening to our questions. I want to pick up where we left off in July of 2022 regarding what I view as the administration's anti-market policies in regard to EVs. They are expensive. The grid is not, we're building a second grid, I guess, on top of the grid we already have, which is a huge cost, and people are paying for that in their electric bills. The batteries have limited range, and despite the subsidization, the market is literally not adopting EVs, regardless of what we want to believe or what you want to say. There's significant inflationary pressures and a glut of electric vehicles, well beyond demand. And so if we consider the current UAW strike, the cost of living has eaten away at these folks' ability to pay their grocery bill and their gas bill. So they're obviously and righteously and rightfully upset. And the administration's subsidization of the electric vehicles is killing their jobs. They know this. On the second point related to EVs, I think it's important to quote the UAW president, Shawn Fain, directly, and I quote, "Not only is the federal government not using its power to turn the tide, they're actively funding a race to the bottom with billions in public money," unquote. Now, you've recently moved to Michigan, I understand it, and I just wonder what you have to say to Michiganders who feel the federal government is using their very tax dollars to destroy their industry and their jobs.
Well, one of two things is going to happen, Representative. Either the EV revolution is going to be made in China or it's going to be made in America. So
But right
what
now
I
it's
have to say
destroying
to
their
these workers
jobs.
is that we are working to make sure that it's made in America.
And it's being subsidized, which is destroying their jobs. So is your position that we're going to lose all these jobs, that's what has to happen, or China's going to build all these vehicles? Is that the position?
One of the reasons we've seen manufacturing jobs grow so much in this administration compared to the manufacturing recession under the last administration is that we're investing in American manufacturing.
You're
and adding
investing
these
with
companies.
our money in things that we don't want. You realize that forcing car companies to make these vehicles at a loss, about $60,000 per vehicle sold, is damaging to the UAW's jobs. In fact, I'm going to just look at Ford. I hate to call them out, but their electric vehicle unit is expected to lose $4.5 billion this year, which is up from $2.1 billion in losses last year. There's a 92-day supply of electric vehicles, which is twice that of the current average of the internal combustion or traditional car. And I would just remind everybody that electric vehicles were one of the first vehicles on the market back in the early 1900s, but they were replaced by better technology then. Now, the average new vehicle transaction price is about, I don't know, I just heard one of my colleagues, $50,000. I got $48,763, which is up $10,000 since your boss became the president. The average used vehicle price is $26,510. Mr. Secretary, the people I work for, my bosses, can't afford what you're forcing on them. These are not market forces. This is the government funding the destruction of our own automotive industry. And I hope you know that approximately 2/3 of EV owners make over $100,000 a year. My bosses don't make that. I don't know if you can justify or how you justify forcing my constituents to pay for EVs and EV infrastructure for coastal elites and wealthy people, but somehow you do.
Well, I need to point out that wealthy people were specifically excluded from the Inflation Reduction Act.
Well, I
wish
just
we could have
gave
had
you the
your
number.
support on
Do you
cutting the cost
dispute
of
that
these.
2/3 of EV owners are owned by people over 100,000 that make over 100,000? Do you
Sure,
dispute that?
the first EVs, of course, were
Do you
acquired by
dispute
more-
that?
No, but that number's going down.
Those are the facts. It doesn't matter if they're going down now.
why were
The
you
folks
against
that
cutting
I
the price of
represent
EVs?
can't afford them today, sir.
Why were you against cutting their costs?
All these factors. I'm not against cutting their costs. The market should do it. But you want the government, you want my taxpayers to pay to cut the cost, which isn't cutting the cost.
If you were of the
it's
view,
subsidizing the cost.
respectfully, Congressman,
Sir,
if you were
with
of the
all
view
these
that there should be
factors
no
combined,
subsidy to propulsion
all these
vehicles, then are
factors
you against
combined
oil and gas
mean
subsidies?
that for
Do you
every
believe that oil
EV
and gas
sold, sir,
subsidies
at a loss, that the cost of the, as my colleague on the other side, the gas-guzzling pickup truck is higher now to pay for the loss as you kill your administration, and you in particular kill the auto industry. And I'll remind you, in 2008, after the financial crisis, the federal government bailed out this industry.
Mr. Secretary, would you like to finish your statement?
Sure, thank you, and I'll try to be as concise as I can. There are some people who I suppose believe there should be no subsidies for anything involving transportation. And I assume in the spirit of philosophical consistency, they would be against subsidizing oil and gas, as well as being against subsidizing Americans being able to afford an EV. There are others who believe that we should force Americans to be in the technology of the past forever. And then there's this administration, which recognizes that the world is moving to EVs, with or without us. And those EVs are either going to be made by Chinese workers or they're going to be made by American workers. And we respect the UAW standing up at the dawn of a new chapter in the automotive industry that created my hometown to make sure that those are not just American jobs, but good-paying American jobs.